Awu friends and enemies. We are not sure who we are at the moment. So. Ooh. Okay. As for this ungodly abomination.
Enjoyed that one. I never...
I've queued up a bunch of history videos for me to listen to keep my mind from roaming free. Alright, let's get started.
If someone loves a flower of which just one example exists among all the millions and millions of stars, that's enough to make him happy when he looks at the stars. He tells himself, my flower's up there somewhere. But if the sheep eats the flower, then for him it's as if, suddenly, all the stars went out. And isn't that important? He couldn't say another word. All of a sudden he burst out sobbing. Night had fallen. I dropped my tools. What did I care about my hammer, about my bolt, about thirst and death? There was, on one star, on one planet, on mine, the Earth, a little prince to be consoled. I took him in my arms. I rocked him. I told him, the flower you love is not in danger. I'll draw you a muzzle for your sheep. I'll draw you a fence for your flower. I didn't know what to say. How clumsy I felt. I didn't know how to reach him, where to find him.
Trying to figure out how to do this.
It's so mysterious. The land of tears. This book was a favorite of Hollywood star James Dean, who burned fast and bright in the world of cinema, but died tragically young. He read it over and over and over, underlining its words and studying it, as if he desperately identified with not only the little prince, but the untamed fox as well. Like all stars like him who die young after bringing something so unique to the world, he left behind an impact that perhaps far outweighed what he actually managed to do. Much like Marilyn Monroe, a great deal of James Dean's image that we hold of him today is actually the great myth that we wove about him and what we wanted him to mean, who we wanted him to be after his death. If you go down to Hollywood right now, you'll find any number of souvenir shops that sell James Dean bobbleheads or shirts with him on it that say like some sassy quote that he never said. He's become an icon of masculinity and suaveness, which is ironic because the James Dean behind this image was a boy who spent years being told to his face that he was unmanly, a sissy, fragile, feminine, unsalvageable. He was someone who struggled to figure out his place in the world after a childhood of loss, rejection, and abuse. He was someone who was somehow both proud of and desperately terrified of his bisexuality. More than this guy, he was this. A lost kid from Indiana farmlands who dreamed of being a star but was unequipped for what being a star entailed, and perhaps not yet strong enough to handle the power that he had over people. So, who really was the man behind this great
Digimon World! Next order!
Just a quick disclaimer before we start though, I need to note that this story involves a lot of quotes from people who were involved in the gay community in the 50s, so the F word is gonna pop up in quotes. Also, I will need to describe some violence and a few graphic details at some point, so please keep that in mind going into this. But with that said, let's get into it. But first, Let's hear a quick word from today's sponsor, Vessi. I honestly had no idea just how valuable a pair of comfortable, completely waterproof shoes could be until now. As you may know, for the last month or so, California's been hit
Give
with a
this
set of
all
huge
you've got.
storms. But luckily, I was prepared with a pair of Vessis that made sure I never had to do battle against the weather if I wanted to go out. Regardless of what the elements throw at you, Vessi shoes are 100% waterproof and will keep you comfortable and stylish in any adventure that you choose. Seriously, I wore them in December when I was filming for my Maud Adams video and I had to hike down a very steep and slippery cliff and across these treacherous rocks. My Vessis were not only completely comfortable hiking, but the whole time I didn't need to spend time breaking them in either. I could literally just hit the ground running wearing them to walk my dog in the rain or to the farmer's market, basically
Give
anywhere
this
I wanted
all
to go.
you've got.
Vessis are made from Dymatex, a dual climate knit material that keeps you cool in the summer and warm in colder weather, with an added rubber outsole for added extra grip in slippery, wet conditions, and extra material laying for more warmth in the cold. And thankfully, they're easy to clean too. After my cliff hike, all I needed to do was rinse them off with
Ready?
some water and wipe them down with a washcloth, and they were spotless.
Take
They've
this
got a wide
seriously.
variety of sporty or casual styles to choose from, including these new extra adventurous types for hiking and stuff. So whatever style you go for, you can be prepared for whatever the weather throws at you. Check out Vessi
Hey!
at the link in the description below for 15% off your entire order. Thank you so much to Vessi for
Ready to
sponsoring this
eat?
video, and now let's get back to
It's
learning
chow
about the
time.
life of James Dean.
Give this all you've got.
James Byron Dean was born on February 8, 1931 in Marion, Indiana. His mother
Let's
was
get started.
Mildred Dean, a drugstore worker, and his father was Winton Dean, a dental technician. Mildred would later tell James that he was named after Lord Byron, and I've said it before and I'll say it again. I think names are a prophecy, and this one gave James both his bisexuality and his audacity. The family would later move to Fairmount, Indiana, now known as James' official home. The Indiana that James was born into was a place that, despite the insistence of many of the people who knew him there, he would barely identify with. The 20s and 30s saw Indiana become the battery empowering the rise of the new Ku Klux Klan, fostering an environment that was deeply unkind to its black, Jewish, and gay residents.
Here
All of
we
these
go.
things deeply troubled James from a young age. Throughout his whole life, he maintained open and proud friendships with many black, Jewish, and gay people, and his detachment from the values of his hometown would put the wheels in motion for James'
Here we
identity
go.
crisis that would later come to dominate his life. James' relationship with his parents, like most aspects of his upbringing, was complicated. While he was incredibly close to his mother, nearly to the point of being smothered, his father was distant and cruel to James, viewing him as too unmasculine. Indeed, as a child, many men and other boys in James' life saw a clear feminine side in him and lambasted him for it. In 1936, Winton Dean got a new job in Santa Monica, California, and the family relocated. James' struggles were not left
Careful
in Indiana,
now.
and in Santa Monica he struggled in school and often would stay home with his mother, who was encouraging
Eat up.
towards his proclivity for theater. Unfortunately, 4 years later,
Ready to
Mildred
eat?
would pass away from cancer, leaving James motherless.
Give this all
When
you've got.
Winton sent James back to Fairmount on a train to bring his mother's body home, he became functionally fatherless too, because James would stay in Fairmount until he finished
You're
high
getting
school,
stronger.
raised by his aunt and uncle. But he never fully recovered from his parentlessness. John Gilmore writes in his book The Real James Dean, whenever the train to Fairmount made a stop, Jimmy went back to the baggage car to make certain that his mother's coffin was still on board. He felt as though he's been
Let's get
stripped
started.
of everything, and that he was being exiled without knowing why. Suddenly, he lost both his parents, and he didn't even know how it had occurred, or the real reasons he was being sent back to Indiana.
Hey!
He not only failed to grasp why his father wasn't
Time to
aboard the
say
train,
goodnight.
but why his father had sent him away without a word as to what he had done to cause such a turning over of their lives. James never adapted
Ready?
well to farm life, but his love of cars was born there. He also
Here you
became
go.
involved in
It's
sports
chow
like
time.
basketball and baseball, and most importantly, he got involved in drama classes. But the years following his mother's death brought a new parental figure to his life that has brought up a lot of arguing
Look
between
at you.
scholars. Reverend James DeWeird. DeWeird has largely been recognized as a heroic figure for Fairmount. He earned a Purple Heart and Silver Star during World War II, and was an incredibly involved figure in the community. The framing of DeWeird as a Fairmount hero and second father to James Dean was heavily emphasized by Indiana writers following James Dean's death, but was not shared by everyone. A lot of people in the town were skeezed out by DeWeird. He was a preacher, sure, but he also took an unusually personal interest in mentoring local boys, taking them on nude swimming trips to the YMCA 20 miles away, or bringing groups of boys to his home for dinner where he'd read them love letters he was getting from women. While filming his final film, Giant, James would confide one night to Elizabeth Taylor that in the years following his mother's death, he was sexually abused by his minister. Given the fact that we know he only had one of those, biographer Joe Hyams posited in his book on James that DeWeird had a sexual relationship with him, and that this was confessed by DeWeird himself. However, it does need to be stated that this alleged confession to Hyams has been widely disputed, not just by other historians, but by some people who knew James Dean intimately, such as his close friends with benefits, John Gilmore, and really it doesn't make any sense since DeWeird was a highly visible public figure at the time, and Hyams was a stranger to him, not to mention the fact that Hyams has a history of misrepresenting what he's told in interviews, so to be frank, it's doubtful that this confession happened. But that aside, given what we know for a fact, which is that DeWeird and Dean had a very close personal relationship for Dean's entire life, and Dean did say that to Liz Taylor, you're free to decide what you believe happened. Regardless, whatever the real situation was, it didn't stop James from looking up to DeWeird in an immense way. In this vein, I sort of see a lot of parallels between him and another important figure in Hollywood history, Scotty Bowers, who I'll talk about a little more later. Not that Bowers is directly related to Dean, I just think that comparing the two can provide some helpful context for
gather
both.
up!
Also, Bowers is kind of going to be a recurring character whenever I bring up gay Hollywood history, so yeah. The high school years saw James evolve into a person with massive dreams. He saw a future for himself as a star so clearly he could almost touch it, and he was willing to do literally anything to reach it. And he knew that life in Indiana was gonna drain him of his spark. He later recalled, "I was never a farmer. I always wanted out of there, but I never ran away because I never wanted to hurt anyone." So after graduation, he headed back to Los Angeles to seek an education in theater arts. He said, "Within 5 minutes, I knew it was a miserable, rotten mistake." He moved in with his dad and stepmom in Santa Monica, only for his dad to bully him into going to SMCC instead of UCLA, because being an actor isn't a manly profession, and the movies are full of panty waists. So James spent as little time at home as possible and quietly took part in local theater productions. He also somehow managed to find him romantically obsessed with his high school teacher, Betty McPherson, who was in LA visiting after being fired from Fairmount High School. He asked her to marry him, and obviously she said no, but they still hung out frequently. By this point, a pattern was starting to emerge with James. His flightiness with regards to his friendships and relationships. He collected them like interesting pebbles on a beach, constantly adding more and more to his basket. His college friend Larry Swindle recalled, "Jim went after my friendship. He thought I was smart, and I was, in ways that he wanted to be. It's unlikely that we would have had any close association at all, if not for his instigation. He must have sensed his deficiencies, because he latched onto people who possessed the traits that he coveted." James' entire goal surrounded his own upward mobility, attaining professional success, and developing an identity for himself by picking and choosing interesting traits from the people that he took into his life. This began with his relationship to DeWeird, who had personality traits that Dean wanted to emulate. And it carried over into nearly every sexual and romantic relationship that he had as well, resulting in a James Dean who both struggled to know himself and found himself incapable of committing to one person. Possibly one of the only exceptions to this was his profound friendship with friend of the channel Eartha Kitt, as both saw each other as profound platonic soulmates. Eartha remembered, "I don't remember meeting Jamie. All I remember is that Jamie was in my life. I never remember going through the emotional isms of do I like him or don't I like him. He was just there. I felt that Jamie was always there." They met in a dance class later in New York, and James sort of instantly took to Eartha, and it's like their spirits were connected ever since. At long last, James was finally allowed to transfer to UCLA. Through connections with his new friends at school, he even landed an agent, Isabel Dressimer. Many of his school friendships didn't last long, however, as his antisocial behavior drove a rift between him and his frat brothers, leading to numerous fistfights that got him kicked out of Sigma Nu. Firmly disillusioned with college life, James dropped out of UCLA. Now, with more time to pursue his career, he took on several TV and radio roles. James recalled, "I remember the first time I had to get the makeup on. I sat there and the makeup guy said, 'Put your head back and keep your chin up.' And he slapped it on and I knew then, squinting at the mirror, where and what I was supposed to be." But life as a new actor was as tough then as it is now. Staring down rejection after rejection, James began to struggle more than ever with poverty. Ironically, given his icon status now, he was rejected frequently because casting directors thought he wasn't good looking enough. They thought his face was weird, or he was too short, or he squinted too much because he had bad eyesight, or he was too fragile and pretty looking. Though that was out of his control, his attitude wasn't, and frankly, his attitude often left much to be desired. Val Hawley writes, "Rather than develop good interviewing skills, he simply became antagonistic towards those who did not adore him at first sight. Though he might fret over a coffee stain weakening his chances in a casting office, he never grasped the importance of appearing in deportment. Nor did he respect Hollywood protocol." Hawley also theorizes that part of James' bad attitude was due to stress from the ever-looming Korean War and its draft. James desperately did not want to join the military. In the end, he told his home board that he was a conscientious objector and a homosexual, and that got him off the hook eventually. Of course, technically speaking, he wasn't really lying. But the piles of stress over jobs and money and war were beginning to take a greater toll on James' psyche. He couldn't sleep due to nightmares of dying. Rather than sleep, he started taking walks along the Venice amusement pier, where he would occasionally flit in and out of the gay bars there. Concurrently, he also took a job at Ted's Auto Park next to CBS Studios on Sunset, a job that would prove to alter the trajectory of James' life for good, because working at the auto park would cross his path with a man named Rogers Brackett, the director of the radio series Alias Jane Doe. Brackett being James' inlet into his future career at this chance encounter at a car park job is fascinating to me because it parallels a similar story that took place not even 5 minutes away, the story that I hinted at earlier about Scotty Bowers and the Richfield full-service gas station. Scotty Bowers was not a movie star by any means, but his role in this era of Hollywood runs concurrent with James Dean's story.
Homosexuality is in fact a mental illness which has reached epidemiological proportions. In 1948, Kinsey said that approximately 28% of adult males have, at one time or another, one or more homosexual contacts.
Scotty secretly ran a service covertly out of the gas station where he turned tricks for Hollywood stars, executives, crew, and more. These stars and other names came to the Richfield gas station, and Scotty would hook them up with someone married for a quick sexual encounter. For many of these Hollywood figures, including big names like Cary Grant, Hepburn, Walter Pidgeon, and George Cukor, who were forced to keep their queerness secret to maintain their careers, and carefully crafted, sanitized image for the public, these hookups through Scotty were often the only way, and indeed the safest way, for them to take part in a sexual lifestyle that was befitting their true identity. And many of the men that Scotty set up with these stars and executives used these encounters to get themselves a foothold in the movie business, not dissimilar from the way that James Dean saw an opportunity in his relationship with Rogers Brackett. When you make a Hollywood film from the late 40s through the 70s, the odds that you're watching someone who either worked for Scotty or used his services is immensely high. And these goings-on weren't limited to Scotty's gas station either. It was spread throughout the entire industry. John Gilmore wrote that he was told, "It was basically a skin circuit. These queens would trade off tricks, take them to parties and pass them off to some agent or director or whoever happened to be there. And then they start looking around for another trick someone else was passing off, getting them out of their hair and making room for some of the new ones." Anyway, I'll discuss Scotty more probably in the future. He's a fairly controversial figure that I can't properly address without totally derailing this video, but you get the picture. My point is, this was a deeply common system in this era. Young young men with Hollywood dreams going to bed with big names because there was literally no other way in, and also as a way to express their sexuality in a mutually safe way in an era where both parties could be arrested for what they were doing, even in private, even if both adults were consenting.
The law itself is such that really there isn't
You did good,
a great deal we can do about those things that occur in private.
You're doing it!
But the most important thing to emphasize here, I believe, is the also
That's the
to
way.
other kinds of activity. The primary effort goes to the reduction of prohibited behavior in public places.
James' understanding of this system was not limited to dreams of his career. It also carried over into his desperation to stay alive. Gilmore continues, Jimmy started to hang around, getting dressed up one night in a suit that maybe needed pressing, the tie dirty, and he would go over to Macombo's or upstairs to the interlude and he'd meet someone there, and might be taken over to Bel Air or another one's house for cocktails. And Jimmy Dean would make himself so ingratiating and so warm and beautiful looking.
Looking good! Good hit!
Brackett got him a small part on the show, and over time their relationship grew closer and closer. Before
Try
long,
this.
Brackett asked James to live with him, and they began.
Good aim!
It's unknown how romantic James' feelings were, at least for some time, but for his part, Brackett was certainly in love with James.
I'm sorry.
They even met each other's parents a truly bizarre move for James. But though their
I don't
relationship
believe
was
it.
long
Hurry,
gone,
get up!
Brackett never fully got over James. In a drunken conversation with his friend Martin Russ after James' death, Brackett took a photo out of his wallet of James sitting rooted in a tree and broke down crying.
You're kidding!
Brackett introduced James to important names and made sure that he was taken care of, but in September 1951, Brackett was asked to relocate to Chicago for business. Shocking everyone, James
wake up.
decided to go with him. More so because he saw it as an opportunity to further his career in New York. He'd had 2 very small roles in movies at this point, but he wanted more, and a lot of
Okay,
people
now.
by this point had told him that New York was the place to be. And it was. After a brief and chaotic visit to Fairmount, James at long last made his way to New York without Rogers Brackett.
Okay, gather up!
Immediately upon arriving in New York City, James got in
It's
contact
chow
with
time.
Brackett's close friend, Alec Wilder,
Eat
a
up.
renowned composer. Wilder and Brackett ensured that James entered New York already well connected and at least initially taken care of due to loaned money from friends. But he soon found that New York was no friendlier than Los Angeles, shockingly, and he still struggled to get his career off the ground. He became depressed sitting for days in movie theaters or just trying to socialize, and his money was running dry over and over. He frequently had nothing for rent or food, slipping in and out of friends' homes and taking favors. A sickness deep in him created constant anguish. It was always there, trapping him in a state of isolation that was only seemingly self-imposed. This was the prison he could not break out of, as he gradually came to see. Dean had this one hurt, a kind of storehouse loaded with a single emotion, a deep hurt embedded and struggling within him. It was what made people want to mother him, that made the girls and boys and the blank want to put their arms around him and tell him it was okay, that he'd be alright after all, that they would take care of him, guard him, protect him. Dean knew what he had. Rogers Brackett ended up phoning a friend, Madison Musser, to get James some help, and Musser took pains to introduce
Okay,
James to
gather
more
up.
connections. It was in this period that James had a chance encounter with Dizzy Sheridan, who
You
you might
hungry?
recognize from Seinfeld or Alf.
Ready to
She was
eat?
a dancer and at first thought that he was completely pathetic, which he was, but
Let's
she
get
eventually
started.
took to him, and soon enough the two were dating and eventually moved in together. As James managed to take on some TV roles, he was found to be an increasingly controversial figure on his sets. He was volatile and difficult to work with,
Toughen
but
up.
simultaneously endearing somehow. People loved him, people hated him, sometimes both. This made it perpetually hard for James to hold down work, even though everyone,
All right.
hated or not, admitted
Ready?
that he was immensely talented. So eventually James
Over
and
here.
Dizzy became so broke that they had to move into separate housing again.
Good night.
And James once
Sleep
again
tight.
moved in with Rogers Brackett, who had by this point arrived in New York City. This made things very complicated. Both Brackett and Dizzy felt a sort of ownership
That's
over
wrong, and
James,
you know it.
James found the rivalry between his two lovers to be entertaining. In her own remembrances, Dizzy
Okay,
describes
now.
Brackett as an evil man who wanted to control Jimmy, but
You hungry?
kind of
You
the
hungry?
only person who saw Brackett this way, as he was very well liked by basically everyone else who knew him. Despite the turmoil, Brackett continued furthering James' career, which unfortunately continued to be underappreciated efforts from James himself. But importantly, James was beginning to pick up on his iconic acting style. Method acting, really. He said, "I can't do something just because somebody tells me to do it. If I get a part as an old man, I watch an old man, listen to him, and then I mock him until I feel like an old man, too. If I get a part, even if it's washing dishes, I'll go home and get a dishpan and wash and wash and wash until my hands peel, and I know exactly how it feels to wash dishes. That's the way I have to act. That's the only way I can act." He auditioned for and was accepted into the Actors Studio, which was a very big accomplishment, especially since it was his first try auditioning, and many famous actors had to audition multiple times before getting in. Before long, James found himself aboard the yacht of Lemuel Ayers, a Broadway film director, producer, set and costume designer. One thing leads to another, and James snags himself his first Broadway role in See the Jaguar. It's unclear exactly what happened on that yacht, but we can kind of inference and make an educated guess. Media writer Robert Wayne Teisel wrote, "Certain aspects of Gene's personal life prompted those who didn't know him to display knowledge. The inside story of how one becomes a star is not always a particularly wholesome story. It is, in fact, unprintable." Regardless of how he got the part, the fact was that nobody could deny
Watch
that
carefully.
James had unmistakable talent. While See the Jaguar was
Nice.
mixed reviews, James was clearly the shining light of the show. The New York
right.
Herald Tribune wrote, "James
Good
Dean
aim.
adds an extraordinary performance in an almost
Nice.
impossible role." As James bounced
Good, just
around New
like
York
that.
in various gigs, he was also bouncing around various different potential
That's
romantic
right.
partners. Some were
Go.
new, some were old flames being rekindled. One of those was Christine White, who remembered, "As you can tell by the kaleidoscope of his career, he's there, and then he's over there. He's with so-and-so, then he's with so-and-so. Then he's in The Village,
That's
writing
the
on his
way.
motorcycle. Then he's in Indiana. Then he's in The Immoralist, and he's busy." James spent
Keep
his
it
time
up.
leaning heavily emotionally on his friends, David Diamond and Alec Wilder, who both
Good
felt
aim.
immensely protective of him and could understand his
That's right.
struggles from a queer angle, too. The other gay
Just
members
like
of their
that.
friend group dubbed
Good
him
hit.
Marshmallow Brando after his clear emulation of
That's the
Marlon
way.
Brando, a comparison
Good
that
hit.
followed him throughout his entire life. James had a complicated
That's the way.
relationship with the group, as despite being unapologetic about his sexuality, he still harbored a bit of internalized homophobia towards more effeminate gay men. Unfortunately, something that wasn't extremely uncommon in this time period and still is today, possibly due to his childhood being berated by his father for being unmanly and girly. Another issue
Nice
was
and
his
calm.
relationship with Rogers Brackett, which seemed to be petering out.
You're doing it.
New friends arrived to fill the void, as they always did. He met Eartha Kitt,
Keep
and
it
then
up.
he met John Gilmore at a drugstore, and a while before this he met Barbara Glenn at a
That's
coffee
it.
shop, whom he had a private but very deep connection to for years. Many of the people in his life begged James to get therapy. Clearly he needed it. He was obviously becoming detached from people in a self-destructive way, despite constantly befriending new people. But he always refused. A lot of his friends, no matter how close they were, never even met each other, nor did he talk about them to others. It's like every person in his life was a little planet orbiting him in his own personal solar system, and everyone was terrified and convinced that one day he would implode and destroy everything in his own great supernova. James and John Gilmore had a long-term friends with benefits sort of relationship
Keep it up.
that lasted until James' death. Based on the two books that John wrote about
Gather
James,
your
John
strength.
seemed like a person that James felt
Why?
very comfortable expressing his
You did
sexuality
it.
around him, in a way that he didn't really want to.
Watch carefully.
John remembered,
Get
it
up.
was like two bad boys, though neither of
I
us
don't
was bad in
believe
a
it.
delinquent or criminal sense, and I
This is the
encourage whatever
worst.
craziness he'd think up. The physical side or attempts at it were extensions of the intensity of this relationship. It was a kind of an affair
I'm sorry.
between bad boy spirits.
I'm so
Between John
sorry.
and Bill Bast, another one of James' close romantic
Hey.
trysts, they both remember nights where James would funnel his own introspection about queerness through them asking questions like, "Have you ever kissed a man?" and so on, and more in-depth questions. And at least with John, these questions led to physical encounters.
Over here.
Though James and Bill Bass never, as they say, consummated their relationship, James played an enormous role in Bill's exploration and acceptance of his own sexuality homosexuality, as he described in his book Surviving James Dean. Somewhat fittingly, in 1953, James found himself cast in The Immoralist as Bashir, a notably homosexual role. It would be the role that eventually got him his first leading role in a film, as Cal in Elliot Kazan's East of Eden. Paul Osborne, who was adapting the book for screen, saw James in The Immoralist and was immediately taken with his performance. Before long, and with Osborne's prodding, Kazan had alerted Warner Brothers that he thought he had a new star on their hands. When Kazan met James the first time, he was interested in the fact that, unlike most people he met, James was not polite to him. He instead acted casual and asked Kazan to ride his motorbike with him. Kazan took him up on the offer, riding through the streets of New York on the back of James' bike. Kazan was instantly interested in him, and eventually, Warner Brothers was convinced. Of course, not before James had to complete a few auditions,
Give
like
this
his
all
famous
you've
one
got.
with him and Paul Newman that cracks me up every time I watch it.
Now look at each other. Just surly. Now what do you think of each other? Wonder whether I go for a girl, you know. Well, you think the girls go to the gym?
Let's get started.
Kiss me. Can't hear it.
Gotta love Paul Newman. But of course, James won out. With James set as Cal, his transformation into a Hollywood star was set on the tracks and rearing. On April 8th, James and Kazan got on a plane together back to Los Angeles, all of James' worldly belongings tied up on his lap in a small brown paper bag.
He's gonna meet a boy, and he's gonna be very strange, and he's gonna be different. But no matter what you see or what you think of him, when you see him on the screen, he's gonna be pure gold.
Though he had Hollywood dreams, James had no intention of being Hollywood's friend. He would be just as irritating there as he was to folks back in New York. He also began terrorizing the neighborhoods of Los Angeles, Hollywood, Santa Monica, and Beverly Hills with his loud car speeding and turning corners at terminal velocity.
You're getting
He made
stronger.
an effort to reconnect with old friends and mentors such as Karen Sharp, but he didn't have long to get his roots down in LA before he was shuttled up to Mendocino and Salinas to film East of Eden. The soundstage scenes were taken back in LA, which is where one day James had a chance encounter with the actress Pier Angeli, and a flashbang summer affair erupted between the two. James' relationship with Pier Angeli is one of the most notable for a few reasons.
You hungry?
Not just because they tormented Elliot Kazan with their loud dressing room lovemaking. James' relationship with Pier would be his first drop into the sea of the Hollywood press machine, a beast that he would struggle to fight against for the rest of his short life. The minute he and Pier became a pair, Warner Brothers leaked their relationship to the press and began crafting a narrative to encapsulate them, as every studio did with all of their stars at this time. Pairing James with a woman that he was already seeing seemed beneficial. They didn't have to pull a girlfriend out of their asses to cover up his homosexual tendencies, and it made it more convincing when James and Pier were seen in public together, helping to rehabilitate his potentially disastrous image that was always at risk of exploding due to his reckless and impulsive behavior. But Pier, having been in the game longer than James and unaware of his demons, made the mistake of denying their relationship to the press, and her denial festered his insecurities. Arguing between the two began to happen more than any lovemaking, and it didn't help that Pier's overbearing mother despised James.
It's chow time. Here you go.
Jack Warner called James into his office one day and shouted, "I want you to stop fucking that broad or you'll be off the picture." Eventually, Pier ended up marrying Vic Damone instead. It's hard to say how torn up James was over this. On one hand, some people say that he was crushed, but others close to him, like John Gilmore, say that his and Pier's love was mostly a media stunt. We know that he frequently referred to Pier as Miss Pizza because she was Italian, and scoffed at the idea of marrying her. Sometimes when asked about it, he'd ramble about something completely unrelated, as if mocking the possibility itself. Plus, they were both never exclusive and dated other men and women during their affair. But his tryst with Pier Angeli was not the end of James' Hollywood press machine woes. He had naively believed that he could become a star while ignoring everything dirty that comes with it. The collaboration with tabloids, the manufactured image. He would soon find out that he was sorely wrong, and he despised it. A man already deep in an eternal struggle to understand himself, now thrust into a world dependent on a fake version of him, was a guaranteed ticking time bomb, and everyone could see it. As I mentioned in my video on Eartha Kitt,
Over here!
one day he walked into the studio commissary to see a large picture of himself blown up and pasted to the wall, and he tore it down in a mad rage, screaming that this wasn't his home and they don't own him. It didn't help that the studio and the press took James' idolization of Marlon Brando and galloped off with it, calling James the new Marlon Brando in preparation for East of Eden's release. And James despised it, taking it as one more attempt to reinvent his identity out of his control. Things only got more extreme when East of Eden finally was released, and everyone finally saw just how bright that James could shine. Almost overnight, James lost any semblance of anonymity he ever may have retained. He had finally gotten his wish of becoming a star, but
Looking good!
everything it came with was beginning to push him over the edge.
You did just like that!
And had public explosive outbursts, the sinking into despair
Good
the
aim!
minute that filming for East of Eden
Yeah!
wrapped up. During production, James was actually living in his dressing room on
You
set,
did it!
but was being forced to leave now that filming was done.
Good
One night,
aim!
his co-star Julie
Nice!
heard sobbing on the soundstage and found James in his dressing room crying on the floor. She recalled, "I held him in my arms and I thought, good lord, this is a continuation of the picture." He didn't want it to be over. He felt completely rejected because we'd finished the picture and it was time for everybody to come home. He felt very, very alone because it was all over. He said it was as if someone had died, had left him alone. Everyone usually becomes very close during filming. One thing of note in this new media circus seeking out all the details of his life was his refusal to ever mention Roger's bracket. He always credited his rise to stardom to the help of James Whitmore, who ran the acting workshop that James attended after he dropped out of UCLA. James would at some point tell Hedda Hopper that it was actually Whitmore who encouraged him to go to New York, and instantly he went, which is partially true. In fact, a lot of people at the time told him to go to New York, even though his TV career in LA was taking off. But, as Val Holly writes, Roger's bracket was the key to Dean's career. He took him in when almost no one else believed in him, fed, clothed, and employed him, and planned and financed his move to New York. Eventually, he introduced Dean to the producer who would put him on Broadway for the first time. No one would deny, of course, that the biggest break in Dean's short career would be tapped by the director Elia Kazan to
Okay,
star in East of
gather
Eden.
up!
But during 1951 and 1952, Brackett was unquestionably the most influential person in Dean's life. It's fairly clear upon a little introspection why James was so unwilling to bring up Brackett, even despite their breakup. As he became more and more familiar with the Hollywood machine, he was learning what lengths he would need to go to conceal his bisexuality. Alec Wilder later wrote, "It's my belief that when Jimmy became a star, he was terrified that his homosexual background would be revealed. It was long before the let it all hang out era. Besides, Jimmy wasn't very bright and he was very young. The public swallowed hook, line, and sinker the publicity that Jimmy had allowed to be spread about him, and this in turn was further distorted by the flagrant lies he himself told about his background." But just like everything else about James Dean, this too comes with complications and contradictions. Once, when directly asked if he was a homosexual, James replied saying no, but that he wasn't going to go through life with one hand tied behind his back. It certainly would have been just as easy to simply stop at no if he was so scared of people finding out the truth. All of this translated to an increase in recklessness in his already reckless behavior when it came to driving and riding motorbikes. He was frequently spotted riding his motorbike on the freeway at high speeds with his hands up in the air, swerving from side to side. Many times his co-stars and friends would confront him, telling him how dangerous that was, that he shouldn't play with his life. And all he would do is smile. But ironically, he was also becoming obsessed with death more than usual. He was somehow simultaneously terrified of dying and wholly unafraid of it.
Keep
He
it
had
up!
visions of his death and often felt like something was wrong with his neck. Asking John Gilmore to massage him.
Good, here goes!
One day out of nowhere, he begged Barbara Glenn to
Just
marry
like
him,
that!
offering her a suitcase of money. And when she
Nice!
refused, as she was already engaged,
Keep it up!
threw fistfuls of cash down
Oh,
the stairway
no.
after her, screaming, "When I die, it'll be your fault."
Yeah!
This reckless
Just like that!
did succeed in getting his second part in a Hollywood leading role as
You
Jim
did it!
in Rebel Without a Cause. I think
Final
like many
blow!
people, Rebel is my personal favorite James Dean film. And a lot of that is because it's the only one of his three films where whispers of his bisexuality float through in his
Keep it up!
relationships to the characters played by
You
Matt
did it!
Wood and Sal Mineo. It's also a poignant
Keep it up!
exploration of 1950s struggles with masculinity itself.
You did
The
it!
movie orbits
Keep it
around
up!
confusion as to
Oh,
what it
no.
truly means to be a man.
We lost?
He lashes out when his masculinity is questioned by others, especially when they call him chicken, because he feels backed into a corner.
You're tearing me apart.
I'm sorry.
Mom,
I'm
I just
so
once I wanted to
sorry.
be right. And I don't want you to run away from me again.
Buzz, on the other hand, manifests his own masculinity through lashing out by challenging other men, culminating in the Chicky run that ends with Buzz's death.
Why do we
Over here!
You gotta do something.
Both men are playing a social game that neither of them really wants to play. Chasing masculinity through this game, through protecting honor, is always going to be ultimately fruitless. Neither two did emulating a nuclear heterosexual American family save anyone either, as the last half of the movie sees Jim, Plato, and Judy playing house in the old mansion, and Jim and Judy, as the pretend parents here, were ultimately unable to use the power of the American nuclear family to save Plato. In the end, his pain is still there, and in the end, he's still killed, because that system wasn't what he actually wanted. What he really wanted was Jim's love as a lover, not as a father. If you watch the film, and especially the
Okay,
screen test, the
gather
energy
up.
moving between James and Sal is incredibly palpable. Plato, though never stated as such outright due to the Hays Code,
Hey!
is very overtly a gay character who is in love with Jim. The way this manifests in his character as being chalked up to
You
a
hungry?
father-son relationship is completely in line with 1950s. Plato would not have had a real model on what his gayness means and how it fits in with what being a man is supposed to mean, so in his admiration for Jim, he figures that it must mean that he sees Jim as a father figure.
Maybe next summer he's gonna take me hunting with him and fishing. His name's Jim. It's really James, but he likes Jim more.
Gabriel Farger writes, "This idea of forming family-like bonds outside of your biological family is something that's been around in queer communities for a long time. Through Plato's tragic death at the end of the film, Nicholas Ray positions Plato as the victim of a rigid and repressive society that doesn't make any effort to understand the views and needs of marginalized individuals. This
Training
rejection and
time.
fear of the other was a prevalent theme in the 50s, using the Cold War and the fear of communism as an excuse to impose regulations which aim to perpetuate conservative values. Ultimately, Ray uses Plato as a vehicle to show how the society
Toughen
of
up.
1950s America was devoid of queer representation at any level due to their hardline conservative view of masculinity. Sal Mineo was honestly the perfect
Okay,
casting
now.
choice for this conflict, because he was a gay man
Eat
in
up.
real life, as I briefly
Ready to
discussed
eat?
in my video on gay cowboy movies. And if his love for Jim as Plato feels a bit real, that's not coming out of nowhere.
I never really thought of them as being unfeeling. I always thought that there was something behind some of his actions. I mean, things like there were mornings when he
Hey!
really was awful to people, in that he totally
Sleep well.
disregarded them, would never say anything, or to me personally. Not a good morning, nothing for a whole day. And all of a sudden, of course, I felt rejected. And I said, what did I do wrong? Of course, I was only 16 then, and I was very impressionable and very sensitive. If he didn't say good morning to me, I would reject the whole day. But when he did, he put his arm around me. That was But what I had felt, strangely enough, was that here was a chance for me to feel what it would be like.
Okay, gather
Someone
up!
close, someone that I idolized, to be grieving for me, and for me to experience what kind of grief that would be. What would he be like? What would he sound like? What would he be thinking? And I wanted to do that scene over and over again. And each time we did do it, he would position me in the kind of position that would work for him to get the emotion going. And it was very moving for me, because he was very moved. And when you see the scene, you see how he broke up in that moment. And it was seeing your idol there, expressing his grief. And that was incredible. And immediately after the scene, I noticed that there was a change in the relationship. He was very protective. And that whole day, he would never let me out of his sight. He was always there. And that felt nice.
Fittingly, in James' efforts to get his friends into parts in Rebel, he tried to get his friend Jack Simmons cast as Plato. I say fitting because it was not a secret to anyone that Jack was in love with James, but James was never into him. In the end, Jack didn't get the part, but instead was cast as a member of Buzz's gang named either Moose or Cookie, depending on what source you're looking at. Bill Bast and John Gilmore were both incredibly unfond of Jack. John described him in both of his books as a strange guy who'd been around Hollywood for a long time and was considered a screaming blank. A little guy who'd been a terror in the gay bars of Santa Monica. This guy with the nose job was a crook, a creep to many, and there began a bickering and bitching among Jimmy's people. And Bill wrote in Surviving James Dean that Jack was persistent in his goal that if he couldn't go to bed with James, he'd one day at least manage to kiss him, even though James had refused him even that, too. If you go up to Griffith Observatory now, you can spot a spooky eyeless bust of James Dean on the front grounds honoring his role there in Rebel. James actually commissioned it himself before he died, but never got to see it finished because he died the day the artist started working on it. But I do recommend paying a visit to the observatory if you like the movie. You can walk around the pavilion where Jim and Buzz had their famous knife fight, and you can go watch a show in the planetarium theater like they did in the movie.
James Dean, rebel without a cause. This is where he said, "Moo." And it was really funny.
That's real funny.
Just remember to wear good walking shoes because odds are you'll have to walk a mile uphill to get there from where you managed to find parking. Typical LA. It's sad to remember that all three of the leads in Rebel died tragically young. James, of course, but then Natalie Wood drowned mysteriously off the coast of Catalina, and Sal Mineo was brutally murdered outside of his apartment in what was likely a homophobic hate crime. By the time that shooting for Rebel wrapped, preparations were already in motion for Giant, which would end up being James' final film before his tragic death. James was cast as Jet Rink, yet another character with ominous similarities to him. Unlike Eden and Rebel, James would not get along with the director of Giant, George Stevens. Stevens went into production already harboring a weird resentment towards James, and it only got worse as production in Texas went on, and James' attitude got more and more sour. Rock Hudson remembered, "It was very easy for me playing Vic to dislike Jet Rink because Jimmy playing Jet was a very distant person. But because he had the most concentration of any actor I've ever worked with, you just had to let him go and watch him, and it was fascinating. I'd be in the scene myself and be watching him because he was so great." By this point, James' stardom was so huge already that people were flocking to Texas from all over just to catch a glimpse of him. But no matter how good James was, it only made Stevens more irritated, and that in turn made James lash out more.
Looking good! That's right!
To make matters worse, we're working on Giant.
You're doing it! Yeah! Hurry! Get up!
Racing. He loved racing
That's the
cars
way.
and motorbikes. It was one
Get
of the
up!
few times he was truly happy.
Darn it!
No matter how depressed he was,
You're
if he got
kidding!
into a car or on a bike and sped off at top speeds, he could come alive again. So this long stretch of time without racing, plus the fact that filming also kept him from his pre-planned trip to see the Indy 500, made James increasingly antsy and pent up. Dennis Hopper, who played Jordan Benedict III in Giant, remembered, "It was pretty clear to a lot of people that when Jimmy had finished Rebel, he was sitting on top of the world and then suddenly Stevens is pulling it out from under him. And
Ready?
I mean, it was a deliberate thing. I don't know why Stevens had it in for him so much, except that Jimmy seems to intimidate him, to cast a bad light on Stevens while they were working. But maybe Stevens was just responding to the way that Jimmy rubbed some really sore spot in the man. I know Stevens was rude to Dean and brushed him aside, so he started to booze a lot, and he'd be late, and he'd be sarcastic, and he just started fucking off. Okay, so he was getting even. During filming, although he was banned from racing, he did have a chance encounter that would prove tragic. Competition Motors in Santa Monica put a brand new Porsche Spider on display, and James knew he had to have it. He bought the Spider and made plans to enter it in a race up in Salinas. Even more ominous was James' final scene in Giant, when Jet Rink is drunk and ruins his reputation on what is meant to be the most triumphant day of his life. James was genuinely completely drunk in that scene, due to his method acting, so horribly so that in combination with the fact that it's the last time he's ever seen in a movie, it's often dubbed the Last Supper. James mumbled so much in the scene that it was completely unintelligible, so he had to be dubbed over in post.
Here you go. Here you go.
Little did everyone know, James would not live to see Giant hit theaters.
training time.
Reflecting on the uneasy time before James went to Texas to film Giant, Bill Bast recalled, "Immortality has been what he had once craved, but where was all this madness leading? Only 2 of his 3 pictures had been released at that point, and already he was being portrayed as everything from a necrophiliac love object
seriously.
to a major god in the pantheon of the arts. Based on the only 2 roles they had seen him play until then, his fans were already turning him into a messianic sex symbol. The real James Dean, the Jimmy that I knew, was getting lost in all the hype of hysteria. I wanted to remember him as he was,
Let's get started.
not as some hyped media freak. This was someone I loved and missed desperately, and I could hardly recognize him anymore. If the myth of James Dean was already overblown, it would become even more so when he passed away on September 30th, 1955. With Bill Hickman, Rolf Witherich, and Sanford Roth accompanying him, James hopped into his Porsche Spyder and set off for Salinas at 2:30 p.m. from Hollywood. Rolf was James' passenger, and Bill and Sanford were following them in a separate car. They headed north on the 5 freeway and then turned onto Route 46, where James began speeding way ahead of the others. At 3 p.m., James and Rolf stopped at the roadside snack bar, where James pulled a cheap ring on his finger and gave it to Rolf. "I want to give you something to show you we're friends," he said. Rolf put the ring on his pinky and warned James not to drive too fast. Even so, they soon got stopped by a cop for speeding, which didn't faze James at all. They stopped one last time at a service station, where James shouted, "Non-stop to Paso Robles," and slammed on the gas without putting on his seatbelt. At 5:45 p.m., as the sun was setting over the California horizon, the Spyder approached Cholum Valley Road along Route 41, where a Ford was making a left turn into the road. The Ford's driver couldn't see James coming, and James didn't slow down. James swore, "That guy sees us, he's gotta stop." And then the 2 cars collided.
Now.
Rolf's head slammed into the dashboard, and he was thrown down the road, instantly going unconscious. As the ambulance arrived, Rolf blearily came to and screamed for James, only to look over and see the crumpled remains of the Porsche Spyder. James was still in the driver's seat, his neck snapped, a horrible culmination of the pains and dreams he's had for years. He had died instantly at 24 years old. The ring that he had given Rolf had been torn off in the crash, leaving a scar on Rolf's finger that he would have for the rest of his life. The news of James' death rocked the press and everyone who knew him like an atom bomb, even though everyone had always thought that his young death was an inevitability. Eartha Kitt recalls the last time she saw him in this interview.
One of the girls in the chorus came to my dressing room and she said, "Jamie's dead." I already knew. He was gone the Sunday before when I had hugged him. And he wasn't there.
Even more ominously, only a couple months prior to the crash, James had filmed a highway safety ad where he said,
"Take it easy driving. Life you might say might be mine."
Both Rebel Without a Cause and Giant were released after his death, giving the world an uneasy sense that it was being haunted by James Dean. And frankly, we've been haunted by him ever since. Because James Dean had so many unfinished dreams. He wanted to be a director, he wanted to act in more movies. He wanted to finally, at last, figure out who he really was underneath the posturing and reckless coping mechanisms. Because he never lived long enough to figure that out, neither have we. And that opened up the floodgates for the media, as well as everyone who knew him, to take turns trying to finish the puzzle. Women came up out of nowhere claiming they were pregnant with his child. He got accused of being a satanic cult leader. Still others immediately sought to portray him as a demigod, as a perfect and untainted pure soul. His body was transported back to Fairmount, Indiana to be buried, and the night before the funeral, it was discovered that the casket had been forced open, but the body was undisturbed. Bill Bast remembers that word had gone around that Jack Simmons had done it, taking the opportunity to finally get that kiss he always wanted. We'll never know if that's true. Val Hawley concludes, "A gentler psychological makeup might have facilitated a longer life, but the dramas that compose Dean's earthly record were achieved because of, not in spite of, his self-destructiveness, insecurity, and vulnerability. The gift of artistry can be a curse as well as a blessing. It is, as John Updike writes, a current from beyond that burns out the wire." James' tireless wrestling with his own identity and purpose is what made him such an immense pool for others to tap into. People from all walks of life saw themselves reflected within him. It's the reason why he's been so adamantly claimed by macho men, lonely women, the LGBTQ community, and more, and why all of the above screamed, "He's ours." But though that instinct to claim him as one thing alone is there for a reason, I think it's perhaps a misguided one. The universality he tapped into that made him a star that bright, to a mythic level that is hard to chalk up to any other star other than Marilyn Monroe, is what made him special to people in the first place. And that boundlessness is what we should embrace about him. And most importantly, it's not fair to James to sanitize him either. He had major issues, and he knew and hated them. He did hurt people, but it's still true that most people, including me, watch him in these 3 films and feel something momentous tugging at us inside. It's hard for me to put words to it. When I watch James on screen, I get a very, very raw reaction. And not just because I think he has a really funny run. I think it's at least in part because when he was acting in these roles, he was absolutely funneling the deepest part of himself into these roles. Cal, Jim, and Jet are all truly facets of James Dean. Certainly not all of him. Even the people who knew and dated him never got that. But it's a peek behind the curtain that he left us with. It's not common to get a performance from somebody that tender. That's why even the people who couldn't stand him any day of the week were still left speechless the minute he finally did get in his element and perform. At James' funeral, many words were said, but I think about these the most. Jimmy's career hasn't ended. It's just beginning, and God himself is directing the production. For the last several years of his short life, James' favorite book was The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. After he passed away, Elizabeth Taylor showed his personal copy of the book to Bill Bast. The pages were worn down, each one of them marked up from being read and pondered over and over and over, and Bill recognized one passage that James had loved in particular. "It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eyes. You become responsible forever for what you have tamed. If you tame me, it will be as if the sun came to shine on my life. Wheat fields say nothing to me, which is sad, but you have hair the color of gold, so it will be wonderful once you've tamed me. The wheat, which is golden, will remind me of you, and I'll love the sound of the wind in the wheat. Please, tame me." Thank you for learning with me about the short but incredible life of James Dean.
Go give Kaz Rowe a subscription if you're on YouTube. I wanted to go longer, but given my late start, I'm worn out and I got work in the morning. So, let's see who we've got available for a raid, shall we? Hopefully tomorrow I won't need something to distract me. And we can focus on just a game. I think wait a minute, hold on. What is up tomorrow? Tomorrow, hopefully, God's permitting, tomorrow, God's permitting, it looks like it's Tales of Arise, so Dave's gonna be playing. So say hi to him for me. Alright. Let's check the raid list. Let's go give Dice a raid if he's accepting raids. Okay, no, he just left to go take care of something. Okay, so we're not going to raid. We're not going to raid him. Oh, Winter's live. Let's go raid their channel. Alright. See you tomorrow, folks.
Always at his command and start channeling retribution.